Yes, experience. It is life's best teacher. And on the road to Damascus, what a teacher Paul had. Hi, Bill Wright here. Yesterday on the Mini Bible College, we left at a cliffhanger. As Paul was being carried away from the mob, he said, "Put me down and let me preach." What do you think Paul preached about? His experience. To find out what happened next, let's join Pastor Dick Woodward.
One of the things we ask you to look at as you read the book of Acts is the preaching of the people who you read about in the book of Acts. The performance of the people of God in the book of Acts is something we should observe in this book, because this is the thing the world could not deny. And part of that performance was the preaching of the people who preach in the book of Acts. Peter was the primary preacher in the early chapters. Then we looked at a magnificent sermon of Stephen. But notice as you come to the second half of the book of Acts, the preaching of the Apostle Paul. We gave you this assignment in our last session. In chapter 21 in the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul is mobbed by a huge mob of people. They're actually pummeling him to death. They're actually beating him to death when a Roman officer brings some soldiers down into the crowd and rescues Paul from this beating. Now, just as they're carrying Paul into the castle where he'd be put in prison, Paul begs the colonel to put him down and let him preach, because this is a great opportunity, and any evangelist or missionary always feels that way when he sees a great crowd of people. What an opportunity to preach the gospel. So Paul talks to this man while he's been being carried. They're actually carrying him over their heads to keep the mob from beating him, and he's talking to this colonel saying, "Please put me down and let me preach." So finally, at the end of chapter 21, the soldiers put him down, protect him from the mob, and then he gives a gesture, and in the Hebrew tongue, he begins to preach. And he gives a magnificent sermon in Acts chapter 22. Now notice, this is not like his sermon on Mars Hill. He doesn't quote poets and philosophers. He doesn't use enticing words of man's wisdom. He pretty much just gives his testimony, as we would call it. He tells about his experience. He gives his own experience of Jesus Christ. Now, as he tells the story of his conversion on the road to Damascus, he tells us, of course, that the only way that we can account for him and his life and his ministry is by the word experience. Paul had an experience on the road to Damascus, and that's what he tells this mob of people about. Now it says, they gave him audience unto this word. This is verse 22 of Acts 22. But then they lifted up their voices and said, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for it's not fit that he should live." And they cried out and cast off their clothes and threw dust in the air. Now, I've been preaching for 30 years, and frankly, I've never had a group of people respond to my preaching by tearing off their clothes and throwing dirt in the air and wishing that I were dead. But this is the way that mob responded to the preaching of the Apostle Paul. Now, at this point, this officer who permitted him to preach decides that the temperature of the mob is heating up again, so he takes him on into the castle. And these Romans, you know, if they arrested you, just to get your attention, they chained you up to a pole and beat you. And so they're chaining Paul up to this pole. They called it examining him by scourging, which means they'd give him about 39 cracks with that whip, just for openers, and then they figured they had your attention when they asked you questions. And as they're about to chain Paul up to this pole, Paul says to the soldier who's chaining him, "Is it lawful for you to beat a Roman who hasn't been condemned?" And this soldier says, "Are you a Roman?" And Paul says, "I am a Roman citizen." Well, the soldier runs over to the colonel, and he says, "You better be careful what you do to that man. He's a Roman." So the colonel runs over to Paul, and he says, "Are you a Roman citizen?" And Paul said, "I am." And this captain says, "I paid a big price to get that Roman citizenship." Paul said, "I was born that way, friend, in Tarsus. I'm a Roman citizen." Now, I can't help but wonder here, where he prevents this beating, why he didn't do that in Philippi. Remember when they beat him in Philippi? Why didn't he tell them then, "You can't beat me, I'm a Roman and you haven't tried me yet"? Obviously, I think he wanted leverage on those magistrates in Philippi so he could turn the city of Philippi upside down the way he did. But here in chapter 22, after they decide that they can't beat him, they just put him in prison. And they decide that the next day they'll have a trial. And so the religious people who have accused Paul in this mob, they come to make their accusations in court. Now, as the court trial begins in Acts chapter 23, it's the beginning of a series of court trials that he has. And I like the way this one begins. It says, "And Paul, earnestly beholding the council, said, Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. And the high priest, Ananias, commanded them that stood by him to smack him on the mouth." In other words, he nodded to a Roman soldier. The Roman soldier just smacked Paul right in the mouth. And it says, "Then Paul said, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall, for sittest thou to judge me after the law, and commandest me to be smitten contrary to the law?" That's King James English, which is really translating what Paul said. When they hit Paul in the mouth, I think the temperament of Paul comes out, because he wasn't expecting it. Now, he didn't see very well. We learned that from his letters. And apparently the high priest wore a white robe and had a big white beard, and all Paul could see was a blur of white up there. But he said to him in the original language, he said, "God will hit you for that someday, you whitewashed wall." He said, "Are you judging me according to the law and commanding me to be smitten? You know, you're asking this man to smack me in the mouth contrary to the law?" And then the soldiers that are standing by, they say to him, "Revilest thou God's high priest?" Is that any way to talk to a high priest? And Paul says, he's getting a little composure now, he says, "I wist not, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, Thou shalt not speak evil of the ruler of thy people." In other words, he's saying, well, fellas, I don't see very well, and I didn't realize that was a high priest. You're not supposed to talk to a high priest like that. Well, Paul looks over the courtroom, and he sees that it's about evenly divided between the liberals, the Sadducees, and these fundamentalist Pharisees. And so he gets up and makes another great statement. He says, "Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, and it's only because I believe in resurrection that I'm being called in question today." And when he said this, there was a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they were divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, neither angel nor spirit, but the Pharisees believe both. And there arose a cry, and the scribes that were of the Pharisees' part arose, saying, "We find no evil in this man. But if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God." And when there arose a great dissension, the chief captain, fearing lest Paul should have been pulled in pieces of them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and bring him back into the castle. You see, Paul looks over that courtroom and he realizes when they smack him in the mouth, which was very subtle, that he was being railroaded. He wasn't going to get a fair trial here. And so he decided just to turn the courtroom upside down. He started a riot because he saw that half of them were Pharisees and half were Sadducees. And he said, "I'm a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, and that's the only reason I'm on trial, is because I believe, like any good Pharisee, in the resurrection of the dead." And that caused a big argument. They ended up having a tug-of-war with this little Jew, trying to pull him to pieces almost, and so the soldiers have to go rescue him again. Now they take him into the castle, and they put him in prison. And 40 Pharisees, 40 Jews get together, and they decide that they're not going to eat or drink until he's dead. Now, have you ever had 40 people commit themselves to each other and say, "We're not going to eat or drink until you're dead"? Ever have any enemies like that? Now, I call these the 40 hungry Pharisees because they never got them, so they must have really been hungry. You know, if they kept that vow, they never did eat anything because they never get them. But they decide to ask this colonel if he will bring Paul down for some more questioning, and then they're going to ambush him and kill him. Now, Paul has a sister, and his sister has a son. This would be his little nephew. And this nephew overhears these 40 hungry Jews plotting this. And so he comes into the prison and visits Paul and tells Paul about it. And Paul says to the soldiers, "Take this young boy to your colonel. He's got something to tell him." And so the little boy goes to the colonel and tells the colonel what these 40 hungry Jews are going to do. If he brings Paul down for questioning, they're going to kill him. And so this chief captain, as he's called in the King James, the Living Bible calls him a colonel, makes a decision. he's going to get this little Jew off his hands, he decides. He doesn't know what he's done or what's going on, but he sure knows that this is a source of trouble. And so it says, he called 2 centurions and said, "Make ready 200 soldiers to go to Caesarea, and horsemen 70, and spearmen 200 at the 3rd hour of the night. And provide them beasts that they may put Paul on and bring him safe to Felix the governor in Caesarea." Isn't this interesting? This little Jew, and by the way the book of Acts describes him, he doesn't see well. They say that he wasn't attractive physically. He probably looked as if the Lord ran out of material when he was making his body. And all those things he went through, all the beatings and the clubbings and the stonings and all of this, you can imagine what he must have looked like. But here's this little Jew and these Roman soldiers. Now think of this. 200 soldiers on foot, spearmen 200 with spears, and 70 on horseback. That's 470 Roman soldiers, and right in the middle on a horse is this little Jew. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, they sneak him out the back door of the castle, and they take him down the coast of the Mediterranean from Jerusalem to Caesarea in Palestine. I don't know if you've ever been to the Holy Land. I used to have an aversion to going to the Holy Land. I even made fun of people who would sing, "I walk today where Jesus walked," because I would say, he's in my heart. And he can't be any closer to me than that. Going over there wouldn't make Jesus any closer to me. But once a home Bible class that I was teaching asked if we would take them to the Holy Land. And since many of them were new believers, I thought it would be a good opportunity to disciple them. And so I agreed to go. And I told them it was my vacation and I wasn't going to teach, and not to ask me any questions because they had guides for that, and I didn't know anything about it anyway. And when we got over there, the first thing we saw was the fortress, which has been restored, just like Williamsburg, Virginia has been restored, in America. This fortress at Caesarea in Palestine, a Roman fortress, has been restored just like it was when Paul was taken there from Jerusalem. And as we drove along the coast of the Mediterranean, from Jerusalem down to Caesarea in Palestine, I couldn't help but thinking about the scene, perhaps on a moonlight night, 3 o'clock in the morning, 470 Roman soldiers, and little Paul sitting on an animal right in the middle of them all, going down the beach there from Jerusalem to Caesarea in Palestine. And I got the little speaker on the bus, and I said, "There'll be a Bible study tonight when we get back to the hotel," because I couldn't wait to tell them about this chapter in the book of Acts. And we had a Bible study every night when we got back to the hotel during the 10 days that we were in the Holy Land. Now, when Paul got to Caesarea in Palestine, there was a governor there named Felix, and he was turned over to that governor. And this governor asked the Jews to come down and formally accuse Paul of his crimes. And so they came down, and here again you have a great message given by the Apostle Paul. And here it's before a governor. And again, he gives his testimony. And at the end of this time, Felix decides that really there isn't any reason for him to be considered a criminal, but he decides that he will just hold him there and give him liberty. He's kept in a real mild sort of house arrest. He'll see what he can finally decide should be done with this little prisoner. Now, Paul must have been a very interesting man to meet. Apparently, the governor, Felix, and his wife, Drusilla, are fascinated with him because just from hearing him give this message in court in defense of himself, they're impressed, and so they ask him for a private hearing. And it says that Paul is happy to do this. And so Felix and his wife Drusilla sent for Paul and heard him concerning his faith in Christ. And as he reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, Felix trembled. And he said, "Go thy way for this time. When I have a more convenient season, I'll call for thee." In other words, he got under conviction when Paul really put it on him. And then he just kept him there in prison because he felt that eventually the Jews would give him a bribe in exchange for Paul. But then at the end of chapter 24, Felix dies, and after 2 years, another governor takes over, and his name is Festus. And this means that the Apostle Paul spent 2 years in a dungeon there in that fortress in Caesarea in Palestine. Now, this governor Festus, he found out soon after he came into power that he had this political prisoner, or he had this religious prisoner on his hands. And so he arranged for a trial. And at that trial, in Acts chapter 25, Paul did something that was the right of every Roman citizen. Paul said in verse 10 of Acts 25, in a trial under Festus the governor, he said, "I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to stand. I appeal unto Caesar." Any Roman citizen had that right. He realized that he wasn't ever going to get any justice in these courts. And so he said, "I appeal to Caesar." And so the governor said, "You have appealed to Caesar you will go." And now Paul's going to go to Rome. Now while he's waiting for the transportation to Rome, a king and his queen visit Governor Festus. The king's name is Agrippa and his queen's name is Bernice. And while they're visiting Festus, and they're probably having a very elegant dinner, Governor Festus says, "You know, I've got the most interesting little prisoner in my fortress here," and he tells them all about this man. And they've heard about him. He's apparently got quite a reputation by this time. And Agrippa says, "You know, I think I'd like to meet him." Remember when the Lord told Ananias about his plan for this man, Paul? He said he's going to preach before kings. Well, here's where this is fulfilled. They bring Paul in before this king, Agrippa, and his queen, Bernice. And it says there's great pomp, a lot of protocol and that kind of thing. And Paul is given an opportunity to speak. Now, this is in Acts chapter 26. And this is one of the great, great orations or sermons of Paul. It says at the beginning of chapter 26, "Then Agrippa said to Paul, 'Thou art permitted to speak for thyself.' And then Paul stretched forth the hand, and he answered for himself." And beginning at verse 2 of chapter 26, you have a magnificent message of Paul. And really, what's the content of the message? Again, it's that same old story. Well, I was on my way to Syria, you see, and I was going to put these Christians in prison and put them to death. And at midday, this great light shined out of heaven, and it knocked me to the ground. And I heard this voice saying, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' And I said to him, 'Who art thou, Lord?' And he said, 'I'm Jesus.' And he tells the story. He met the risen Jesus on the road to Damascus. He gives the story of his conversion. Now, as he is coming down the home stretch of this great sermon, the governor apparently is really gripped by what Paul is saying. I think if you could have heard Paul preach, you would have been gripped by what you heard. And the governor just burst out and said, "Much learning has made you mad, Paul." Isn't it interesting that they accused Jesus of that? They accused the prophets of that. And they accused the Apostle Paul of that. Festus said to him, "Thou art beside thyself. Much learning hath made thee mad." This expression, "beside yourself," is a very interesting expression. In the Greek, it really means you're eccentric. What Festus is saying is this: all of us have a center around which our life revolves. And for most people, that center is ego. Most people are dedicated egotists, and the center around which their life revolves is ego. Well, the accusation of Festus was, "Paul, you've got another center. You're beside yourself. You're eccentric," is what he said in the Greek. "You're over here, and all the rest of us are over here." Well, that was true. Paul was eccentric. He did have another center around which his life revolved, and that center was Christ, the risen Christ whom he'd met on the road to Damascus. But it's obvious that Festus is impressed with what he hears, and then Paul turns to the king. Now, King Agrippa is a Jew, and Paul, I think, perceives that Agrippa is under conviction from what he's hearing. And so he says, "King Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? I know that thou believest." He says, gesturing to the king, "The king knoweth of these things, before whom I speak freely. For I am persuaded that none of these things are hidden from him. This thing was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you believe the prophets." Now, it says, "Then Agrippa said to him, Paul, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian." Now, again, the scholars have a controversy here. Some say that Agrippa was really making a snide remark. What are you trying to do, Paul? Make a Christian out of me? You know, my goodness, Paul, you've almost persuaded me to be a Christian. And that he wasn't sincere. Frankly, I don't agree with that. I believe Agrippa was sincere. Paul's response to him certainly was sincere. Paul said to him, I would to God that not only thou, but also all that hear me this day, were both almost and altogether such as I am, except these bonds. Agrippa says, almost. You've persuaded me to be a Christian. And Paul holds up his chains and he said, Agrippa, I wish that all men were not only almost, but altogether like I am, except for these chains. Now, another reason why I think Agrippa was sincere is the little epilogue here. It says, when he had thus spoken, the king rose up, and the governor, and Bernice, and they that sat with them. And when they were gone aside, they talked between themselves, saying, this man hasn't done anything worthy of death or of bonds. And then Agrippa said to the governor, this man could be set at liberty if he had not appealed to Caesar. Agrippa says, if he hadn't appealed to Caesar, I'd set him free. But because he had appealed to Caesar, he had to go to Rome. Now again, I believe Paul went to Jerusalem because God the Holy Spirit told him to go. He said to those Ephesian elders, I'm going to Jerusalem bound in the Spirit. The Spirit led Paul to go to Jerusalem because he had a great ministry there, even though he suffered and paid a big price for it. I believe the Holy Spirit bore witness to him when he was in Corinth, when he had that divine intervention there in Corinth, and God showed him something about preaching the gospel and said, just announce it, Paul, and you'll find out who my church is. I have many people in this city. God told him there in Corinth that he was also going to bear witness in Rome. He was going to have to go to Rome. I believe the reason why Paul appealed to Caesar was not just to get his day in court or justice. In his biography, you'll find the fact that the Holy Spirit laid it on his heart that he was going to go to Rome. Now, I believe he appealed to Caesar because he wanted the Roman government to pay his expenses, And so he went to Rome at the expense of the Roman government. Now, in chapter 27, you have the story of Paul's journey to Rome. It's a very exciting chapter. They put him on a ship, and they're about to set sail for Rome. And it's a very evolved thing about weather and so forth. What was the wise or prudent time to set sail on a journey like that? And Paul doesn't hesitate to say to these Roman officers who had taken him to Rome on a ship, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading in the ship, but also of our lives. And he's trying to tell them, you shouldn't set sail right now. Well, of course they don't listen to him, because they're Romans and he's a prisoner. So they set sail, and sure enough, just like Paul had warned them, they get caught in a terrible storm. And it says they have to throw over the tackle, and they're in this awful storm and in dire straits. And it says, the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was taken away. And after long abstinence, in other words, he bit his tongue for a long time, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, you should have listened to me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. But then he says, But now I exhort you, be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of anyone's life among you but of the ship. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God. It shall be even as he told me. He said, nobody's going to lose their life. You're going to lose the ship, but God told me nobody's going to die. So cheer up, nobody's going to die. Well, the storm continues, and it says that they don't eat anything for 14 days. And at this point, Paul shows us that he's a great leader. He gets up in front of all the people again, and he besought them to take meat, saying, This day is the 14th day that you have continued fasting. Wherefore I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health. For there shall not a hair fall from the head of any of you. How does he know that? Because God told him. And when he had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all of good cheer, and they also took some meat. And we were in the ship 260 souls. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and cast out the wheat into the sea. And then the story goes on and tells that finally the ship was caught in such a way that it was broken up into splinters. And it says that the soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners, but the centurion who was in charge of this ship, because he wanted to save Paul, he gave the order that the prisoners shouldn't be killed. And so they swam if they could, or they floated on boards up onto the land that was nearby. And this land apparently turned out to be Melita, it's called. Now, when they got onto the land, here's a little miracle. It says they were gathering wood for a fire, and Paul had a viper fastened on his hand, but he just shook it off. At first, the people, when they saw that happen, they thought he was a criminal who was finally getting his due. But when he shook off the viper into the fire and didn't swell up and die, they said he's a god. Well, have you gotten acquainted with this little man? This is the man who's going to write all these letters we're going to survey now. I believe it's very important as we come into the second half of the book of Acts to get acquainted with the author of half of the New Testament.
When I think of the Apostle Paul, one word comes to mind: perseverance. He was beaten, shipwrecked, mocked, threatened, and imprisoned, but his message never changed. His perseverance never wavered. Well, that wraps up another day of fine teaching with Pastor Dick Woodward, and I hope you've been blessed by the presence of the Lord today as you've listened. And if you enjoyed today's program, I hope you'll join us again next time as Pastor Dick takes us once again into a new lesson as he continues teaching us through the Bible. Thank you, and may God bless you until we meet again.